first light of dawn filtered through the grimy windows of the rural mountain cabin, casting a soft glow on the worn wooden floor. Annie Lawson was already up, bustling around the kitchen, her hands deftly preparing breakfast. The aroma of frying bacon filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of coal dust that seemed to permeate every corner of Coal Creek. Tommy Lawson sat at the kitchen table, his face etched with hard lines from a life of coal. He had been working in the mine since he was a boy, just like his father before him. Today was no different. The call of the mines was relentless, and the dangers ever present. Annie placed the morning breakfast in front of him, her eyes full of silent concern.
"Eat up, Tommy. You need your strength,"
she said, her voice steady despite the fear she felt every time he descended into the depths of the earth. Tommy nodded while taking a bite and savoring the taste, but his thoughts already drifted to the day's work. He knew Annie worried, but there was little choice. The mine was the only way a man could make a living in Coal Creek. Their 2 children, Sammy and little Ruth, scampered into the kitchen, their laughter a stark contrast to the somber mood of their parents. Annie smiled at them, her heart lifting slightly. She lived for these moments of simple joy, even as the weight of their reality pressed down on her. As Tommy finished his breakfast, he glanced out the window, catching sight of the mountains looming in the distance. The early morning mist clung to their rugged slopes, a beautiful yet haunting reminder of the world that lay beneath. He stood up, kissed Annie on the cheek, and ruffled the hair of his children. "Be good today, you hear?" he said with a forced smile. With that, Tommy grabbed his lunch pail and headed out the door, and moments later, there was the familiar crunch of gravel under his boots as he made his way down the narrow, winding path to the mine, where a group of miners had already gathered. Among them was Jack Turner, a young man with dreams far beyond the confines of Coal Creek. Jack had always been restless with a wandering eye. He had lost his father in the coal mines when he was just a boy, and because of that, he constantly dreamed of a life outside of mountains. Yet, Tommy had taken Jack under his wings and shown him the in and outs of how to survive and endure the grueling life of a miner. "Morning, Jack," Tommy greeted him, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "Morning, Tommy," Jack replied, his eyes bright with determination. "Ready for another day in paradise?" Tommy chuckled, though there was little humor in his voice. "As ready as I'll ever be." The whistle blew, signaling the start of their shift. The men donned their helmets and descended into the dark, claustrophobic depths of the mine. The air was thick with black dust, and the sound of pickaxes striking rock echoed through the tunnels. It was a world of perpetual darkness, where the only light came from the dim lamps on their helmets. Hours passed in a blur of back-breaking labor. The miners worked side by side, their camaraderie, a small comfort in the oppressive darkness. Tommy and Jack often found themselves working together, sharing stories and dreams during their brief breaks. "Ever think about leaving this place?" Jack asked during one such break, his voice low. Tommy sighed, leaning against the cool stone wall. "Sometimes, but Coal Creek's all I've ever known. My family's here. Besides, where would I go?" Jack nodded, understanding how tradition and responsibility kept Tommy tethered to the town. "I get it. Just sometimes I think there's got to be more out there, you know?" But in that moment, before Tommy could respond, there was a distant rumble that shook the ground, sending a cascade of dust and loose rock raining down on them. Panic surged through the tunnel as the men realized what was happening. "Cave in!" someone shouted, and chaos erupted. In an instant, Tommy and Jack scrambled to their feet, their hearts pounding with fear as they raced towards the exit, the walls closing in around them as the tunnel began to collapse. The sound was deafening, a roar of rock and earth swallowing everything in its path. Tommy felt a hand grasp his arm, and he turned to see Jack. "We'll never make it that way. There's not enough time," Jack yelled, pulling him towards a narrow side passage. They stumbled through the darkness, the tunnel trembling with aftershocks. Finally, they emerged into a larger chamber, gasping for breath. The sound of the collapse faded, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Tommy looked around, his heart sinking as he realized they were cut off from the main tunnel. We're trapped. Back on the surface, wagging tongues spread the news of the cave-in like wildfire. Annie was in the middle of hanging laundry when she heard the frantic shouts. Her heart froze, and she dropped the basket, running towards the mine with dread clawing at her insides. Back at the entrance to the mine, a crowd of women and girls had gathered, their faces etched with fear and desperation. Reverend Samuel Carter stood among them, offering words of comfort and prayer. But Annie could barely hear him over the pounding of her heart. "Tommy!" she cried, her voice breaking. The foreman, Mr. Jenkins, approached her, his expression grave. "We're doing everything we can, Mrs. Lawson, and I promise you, we won't stop until we find him." Annie nodded, tears streaming down her face. She clutched her children to her, praying for a miracle. Underground, Tommy and Jack pressed on, searching for a way out. Their lamps flickered, casting ghostly shadows on the walls. The air was thick with dust, making it hard to breathe. "Over here," Tommy said, pointing to a narrow opening. "It might lead to an old shaft." They squeezed through the opening, crawling on hands and knees. The passage was tight and claustrophobic, but they had no other choice. After what felt like an eternity, they emerged into a small abandoned shaft. Tommy took a deep breath, his lungs burning. "We need to signal the rescue team. They might be able to hear us." Jack nodded and began tapping a rhythmic pattern on the wall with a rock, hoping the sound would carry. They waited, each second stretching into an agonizing eternity. Finally, a faint response echoed back. Relief washed over them as they realized they had been heard. "Hold on," a voice called from above. "We're coming for you." Hours later, as the sun began to set, Tommy and Jack were pulled to safety, their bodies bruised and exhausted, but alive. Annie rushed forward, tears of joy and relief streaming down her face as she embraced Tommy, holding him tight.
I thought I lost you.
The entire town of Coal Creek had helped dig the trapped miners out. This time, they were lucky. There would be no funerals tomorrow. Yet everyone knew there was only so many times a man could cheat death down in the mines, and the ordeal had left its mark on both men. For Tommy, this was the third time he had survived a cave-in, but for Jack, he had never experienced this before, and he now knew firsthand what his father's last moments must have been like. Most of the miners who had survived had already returned to work, unable to afford missing a single day. But not Jack. He wasn't hurt, but he couldn't get his mind right. The event kept playing out over and over in his head. That evening, Jack sat with his wife and young boys, staring at the flickering fire in their small living room. The cave-in had shaken him to his core, making him reconsider how hard life was in Coal Creek. But it wasn't like he could just quit and take another job. Heck, there weren't any jobs. And once a man started working in the mines, he was in debt to the company, and before he knew, he could never stop working while he tried to pay his debt off. This wasn't the life Jack wanted for his wife, and the thought of his boys growing up and working in those same mines haunted him. "What if I had died in that cave-in?" Jack said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. "What kind of future would our boys have then?" Martha looked at him, her eyes wide with concern. "Jack, don't talk like that. You're here now, and that's what matters." "No," Jack insisted, shaking his head. "I can't let our boys grow up and work in those mines. I have to do something, Martha. I have to find a way out." The next morning, Jack walked down to see Tommy, who was still recovering from 3 broken ribs he sustained during the accident. He found Tommy sitting alone on the front porch. "Brother, we need to talk," Jack said, his voice urgent. Tommy looked up, wiping sweat from his brow. "What's on your mind, Jack?" "I'm leaving Coal Creek," Jack said, his words hanging heavily in the air. I'm taking my family and moving to Detroit. They say there's work in the factories there. Better pay too, and safer conditions. A man can make a decent life for his family there. Tommy's eyes widened in shock. Detroit? That's a long way from here. You don't even have family there? Who's going to help you if something goes wrong? I can't rightly say, I guess, but it's a risk I'm willing to take, Jack replied. The cave-in made me realize that I can't keep risking my life every day. I want a future for my boys, a future that doesn't involve never even seeing the sun shine, cause they're digging down deep in the ground like a mole. Tommy shook his head, doubt clouding his features. I don't know, Jack. The mines are all I've ever known. My pa and my grandpa worked in the mines all their life, and they made a living. Living? Jack shot back. You call that living? Hell, their bodies were broken and their lungs full of coal dust. Both of them were crippled and broke after those mines chewed them up and spit them out. Jack placed a hand on Tommy's shoulder. Now I know you've taught me a lot, and I thank you for that, brother. But you know, as well as I do, the same fate awaits you if you stay here, Tommy. You deserve better than this, and so does your family. Come with us to Detroit. Take a chance. Tommy looked down. I don't know, Jack. What if it doesn't work out? It will, Jack said firmly, but you have to be willing to take that step. But Tommy went silent. Despite Jack's pleas, Tommy couldn't find the courage to leave. The mines were all he had ever known, and the fear of the unknown was too great. Jack left Coal Creek with his family, making the journey to Detroit, where he found work at General Motors assembling engines. His family thrived, benefiting from better wages, living conditions, and education. After a couple years, they were able to put a down payment on their first house, and Jack bought a used car. They built new lives and were actually chasing the American dream. Yet, Jack often found himself thinking of Tommy. And then 12 years later, on a cool spring morning, Jack received a letter addressed from Coal Creek, Tennessee. It was from Tommy's wife, Annie.
Dear Jack, I know Tommy would have wanted me to write you under better circumstances, as would I. And, truthfully, it breaks my heart to put these words to paper and have to restrain myself from flooding both paper and ink with my tears. But I lost Tommy last week. That damn mine. It finally got him. There was a cave-in on Cross Mountain Coal Mine over in Briceville. It was a disaster. 84 men were trapped in an underground explosion. The bad air killed every one of them that didn't die in the explosion. We lost nearly all of them, Jack. And I lost my Tommy forever. 3 days ago, they buried him all up in Briceville, in a place called Miner's Circle. Tommy loved you, Jack. He loved you like a son. I know he would have wanted me to let you know.
A few weeks later, Jack filled his car up with gas and just started driving. He never really thought about where he was going, but something inside of him led him south, and before long, the plains of Illinois and Ohio gave way to the mountains of eastern Tennessee. He had to go say goodbye to Tommy in person. The cemetery was on a steep bluff, so steep that Jack had to park his car and walk up the quiet dirt path to the top. The scene was surreal. 84 mounds of fresh earth spread out in a circle. 84 lives lost in an instant in one of the worst coal mining disasters in Tennessee history. Every man in Coal Creek lost their life that day, except for 5 men who were saved. Suddenly, nearly every woman in the entire town was a widow. As Jack visited Tommy's grave, the old friend stood in silence as he placed a hand on the headstone. "I'm sorry, Tommy," he whispered. "I wish you'd come with us." The Cross Mountain Mine disaster occurred on December 9, 1911.